The diesel engine, sitting in the back row of Saturday's consignment sale outside Frankfort, Kansas, had been written off by every man who walked past it that morning. Rust through the valve covers, a crust of dried mud caked along the oil pan, a hand-lettered tag from the sale barn read scrap only, and the auctioneer's own ringman had already steered 2 different bidders away from it before lunch. Every man in that yard saw the same pile of iron. Every man except one. And he was the one a younger bidder had just told to get lost. Otis Renner was 74 years old, 8 days past the worst harvest scare of his life, and he did not get lost. He raised his hand instead. 6 bids later, the engine nobody else in that yard would touch belonged to him for $640, and what he did with it over the next 10 days is the reason his family quit talking about selling the farm. Stories like this don't get told much anymore. If you grew up around people who worked with their hands and didn't say much about it, go ahead and hit subscribe. We're going to keep telling them as long as you keep watching. Marshall County, Kansas, sits in wheat country, the kind of ground that looks flat from the highway and isn't, not really. Once you've spent 70 years learning the particular low places where water stands and the particular ridges where it doesn't. Otis ran 1,680 acres there, the same ground his father had farmed before him and his grandfather before that, split between dryland wheat, milo, and a few hundred acres of native grass he kept for a small cow herd, more out of habit than profit. Most men his age in the county had long since hired a custom cutting crew to bring in their wheat, paying somewhere around $24 an acre to have somebody else's combine roll through, or leased the ground out entirely and moved into town to a house with a smaller yard and fewer decisions in it. Otis still climbed into the combine cab himself every June, same as he had since 1971, and most years that didn't strike anybody as remarkable. It was just what he did. The way some men keep mowing their own lawn long after they could pay somebody to do it cheaper. The summer of 2023 was not most years. His main combine, a 1981 International Harvester 1460, he'd bought new back when the company still stamped its own name on the hood, 2 years before it folded into case and started stamping a different one. Threw a rod on the Thursday before he meant to start cutting. Threw it clean, the kind of failure a man hears from inside the cab before he understands what he's hearing. A deep, metallic knock followed by a silence that felt louder than the noise had. He shut it down in the middle of his own home quarter and sat there a minute before he climbed out. The cab was hot and quiet in the particular way a machine goes quiet when something inside it has actually died rather than just stalled, and for a moment he found himself thinking, of all things, about Dorothy, and how she used to bring a thermos out to that same field every June without him asking. And how there was nobody left now to notice if a man sat too long in a dead machine feeling sorry for himself. He didn't sit there long. He climbed down, walked the half-mile back to the house, and started making calls. His son-in-law, Brad Whitfield, drove out that same evening. Brad worked in town, sold crop insurance, and had been gently raising the subject of selling out for the better part of 2 years. Ever since Otis's wife, Dorothy, passed in 2020 and the house got quiet enough that Brad and Otis's daughter, Carol, started worrying out loud about him being out there alone. Brad wasn't unkind about it. He stood next to the dead combine with his hands in his pockets and said maybe this was the sign they'd all been waiting for. Heartland Agri Partners had a standing offer on the table, $2,950,000 for the whole operation, ground and bins and all, and Brad pointed out, reasonably enough, that a man could retire awfully comfortable on that kind of number instead of fighting a 40-year-old engine every summer. Dad, nobody would think less of you, he said. Otis didn't argue with him. He just said he'd think about it after harvest. The dealership in town quoted him $38,000 to source a rebuilt long block for the 1460, if they could even find one, and admitted they weren't sure they could. The parts manager, a man not yet 30, suggested it might be smarter money to trade the whole machine in toward a new case axial flow. Sticker price $418,000, financed over 7 years. He pulled up a brochure on the counter screen, turned it toward Otis, and talked through the cab features for a good 5 minutes before Otis finally told him he'd just come in for a price, not a sales pitch. He wasn't trying to be cruel about it. Exactly, he just couldn't picture, the way younger men sometimes can't, why anybody would spend real effort saving something that old when something new sat right there on the lot, clean and ready and under warranty. Not foolish. Just young enough to think new was always the safer bet. The same as a lot of men his age had started to believe about most things, not just combines. So on Saturday morning, Otis drove out to a consignment sale on a closed-down farmstead outside Frankfort, 20-some miles north, where a salvage operator was clearing out a yard of wrecked and written-off equipment for scrap weight. The morning was already hot by 9, the kind of dry Kansas heat that makes a man's shirt stick to his back before he's done anything to earn it. Pickups lined both sides of the gravel approach, mostly newer ones. Mostly men in their 40s and 50s who'd come for parts off a row of late-model equipment toward the front of the lot. Cecil Drummond, a retired schoolteacher from Frankfort who came to every sale within 30 miles whether he meant to bid or not, stood near the coffee thermos the whole morning, never raising his number past $400 the entire time, just liking the company and the noise of it. Otis wasn't shopping for a long block. He was shopping for parts, anything close enough in spec to get him through one more harvest. What he found, sitting low in the weeds behind a row of dead pickups, was a diesel engine pulled from a combine that had sat in 18 inches of floodwater for 3 days back in the spring of 2019, total lost by an insurance company that never looked past the water line on the block. A man named Dean Kepler, who ran the salvage end of the operation and had his own number on most of what was in that row, watched Otis circle the engine twice, get down on one knee in the mud to look at the cylinder bores through the open ports, and finally raise 2 fingers when the bidding opened. "Get lost, old man," Kepler said, not loud, more tired than mean, the way a man says something he's said before to people who never listen. "That block's scrap. I was fixing to weigh it out Monday." He had a stack of similar iron behind him bound for the same scale, and as far as he was concerned, an old man crouched in the mud reading numbers off a cylinder wall was wasting daylight that belonged to somebody else. Otis didn't answer him. He just raised his hand again when the bidding opened. The auctioneer started it at scrap weight, somewhere around $200. Mostly as a formality, the way a man opens a sale on something he doesn't expect to draw a fight. Kepler bid against him twice out of what looked more like habit than real interest, the price climbing in $20 jumps that felt, to most of the men standing around, like watching 2 people argue over a parking spot nobody wanted in the first place. By $400, Kepler had stopped bidding and started shaking his head instead. By $600, the auctioneer himself paused long enough to ask Otis, half joking, whether he meant to keep going. Otis raised his hand one more time. 6 bids total, ending at $640. What Kepler saw was rust and mud, and a tag that said scrap. What Otis saw, on his knees with a flashlight, was a cylinder wall with almost no glaze wear at all, a casting date stamped 2017, and an oil residue pattern that told him this engine had run maybe 400 hours total before the flood put it under. Not the 4,000 or 5,000 a worn-out block usually carried. He checked the cylinder walls. He checked the bearing journals through the side cover. He checked the injector pump for the kind of scoring that comes from years of dirty fuel, and found none. Insurance companies didn't total a combine because the engine was bad. They totaled it because water got into the cab wiring and the electronics, and because the math on drying out a whole machine never penciled out next to a payout. Nobody at that flood claim had ever pulled the heads and looked. It was, Otis told Carol later, a little like writing off a perfectly good truck because the upholstery got wet, without ever checking whether the motor underneath had a thing wrong with it. Otis had pulled enough engines apart in his life to know the difference between worn and merely wet. And he was fairly sure, though he'd tell you straight he couldn't be completely certain until he had it apart on his own bench, that what he was buying for $640 was close to a brand new long block, wearing 60 years of somebody else's bad luck on the outside. His own father, Carl Renner, had taught him that distinction 60 years earlier, in a shop that smelled permanently of cutting oil and cigarette smoke, on a farm 3 miles from the one Otis ran now. Carl never had much patience for buying what could be fixed instead. He'd lived through enough lean years in the 1930s and 1940s that the habit never left him even once money got easier. And he passed the habit down to his son, the way some fathers pass down a hunting rifle or a pocket knife, without much ceremony, mostly by making the boy stand there and hand him tools until he started knowing which one to reach for before being asked. Otis still remembered a tractor Carl had bought for parts money in 1958. A machine the dealer in town had called gone, not worth the trouble. Carl had pulled the head off it on a Sunday afternoon, run his thumb along the cylinder wall, and said, "Plain. Engine's not bad. Block's just wet." Nobody else standing in that shop believed him. He was right anyway, the same as he usually was about engines, and the tractor ran another 11 years after that. Otis spent 2 years in the Army between 1968 and 1970. Most of it in a motor pool in Texas he never saw combat from, fixing deuce-and-a-half trucks for sergeants who didn't much care how a 19-year-old from Kansas had learned what he knew, only that he had. He came home, married Dorothy in the spring of 1971, and took over the home place that same year when Carl's hands had gotten too stiff to hold a wrench steady. Dorothy never once complained about a Saturday lost to a tractor that wouldn't start, not in 49 years of marriage, though she did, every so often, point out that a new water heater would probably run her fewer headaches than whatever Otis currently had spread across the kitchen table. He buried his father in 1989 and his wife in 2020. And somewhere in the 31 years between those two funerals he rebuilt more engines than he ever bothered to count. Mostly his own, occasionally a neighbor's. Always for less than what it would have cost to buy new. And always, his daughter liked to say, because he flat out enjoyed it more than he'd ever admit out loud. He had the salvage engine apart on his shop bench by Sunday night, and had confirmed what he suspected by Monday morning. The bores were clean. The crankshaft journals measured within spec on every cylinder. The bearings showed almost no wear at all once he had them laid out on a clean rag in the order he'd pulled them. The kind of order that mattered to nobody but him. A combine that had drowned in a flood 4 years earlier had, sitting inside it the whole time. An engine with less wear on it than most farm trucks put on in a single season. He spent the next 4 days swapping it into the 1460s chassis, replacing wiring harnesses that hadn't gone underwater along with it. Working most nights past 11 with a space heater running in the shop and the radio tuned to a station out of Salina that played the same 40 songs on a loop he'd long since stopped hearing. There was no flood report or insurance file to settle the question for him this time. Only his own hands and the math of hours run against hours bought. By the time he had the long block bolted back into the 1460s chassis, he understood the bet he'd made well enough to say it plainly to Carol on the phone that Thursday night. Either the engine held under a full day's load, same as it had held under a flashlight in his shop, or it didn't. And either way he'd know inside the first hour of cutting. By Friday, July 1st, the combine ran. He was 6 days behind every neighbor who'd hired a custom crew, and the forecast out of Wichita that morning was calling for a wet system to move in over the 4th of July weekend. 3 days of rain starting Tuesday. The kind of rain that could knock a standing wheat crop flat and dock the grade on whatever was left standing once it dried out enough to cut. He had 640 acres still in the field. He had 3 days to get it out. He started cutting Saturday morning at first light and didn't stop except to refuel and once, briefly, to replace a belt that had started squealing somewhere around 2 in the afternoon. "Belt's just loose," he told himself. Kneeling at the side panel with a wrench, the same way his father would have said it, dropping the article without thinking, the way a man talks to himself when nobody else is around to hear how he sounds. He was right about the belt. The wheat stood heavy that year, the heads bent slightly under their own weight the way a good crop does right before it's ready, and every hour he wasn't cutting felt to him like an hour the weather was getting closer for free. He watched the header. He watched the moisture meter. He watched the line of gray building low on the western horizon 2 evenings running, further off than it looked, he kept telling himself, though he couldn't be entirely sure of that either. Carol drove out Sunday with sandwiches and stood at the edge of the field a long while watching the old combine work a pattern she'd watched her whole life, dust rising gold in the evening light behind it, the header running steady, no knock, no hesitation, nothing but the sound of an engine doing exactly what an engine is supposed to do. Brad came out Monday evening after work, stood next to her, and didn't say anything at all about Heartland Agri Partners. He just watched. The way a man watches something he's starting to understand he might have been wrong about. Otis finished the last field at 9:40 on the evening of July 3, headlights on for the final hour, the moisture meter reading a clean 12. 4% on the last load. Rain started over Marshall County a little before 6 the next morning, and didn't let up for 2.5 days. The wheat that came off in those final 3 days ran 52 bushels to the acre across all 640. And at $7.40 a bushel that came out to just over $246,000. Every dollar of it harvested at full grade because it came out of the field dry. 3 hours ahead of weather that would have docked it hard. Maybe ruined a third of it outright if it had still been standing when the rain hit. Heartland Agri Partners quietly let its standing offer lapse that fall, and nobody on Otis's side of things brought it up again. Carol stopped mentioning retirement homes in passing the way she had been. Brad started calling ahead before he drove out, the way you call ahead on somebody whose judgment you've started trusting again instead of just checking on. By the county assessor's most recent figures, the 1,680 acres alone pencil out to a little over $2, $7 million at current dryland values, with the house, the bins, and the equipment pushing the whole operation's worth to just north of $3. $1 million, a number nobody in the family argues about selling anymore. A neighbor 2 sections over, a younger man named Trevor Aldis, who'd bought into farming late and was still learning which corners to cut and which ones not to, called Otis that fall about a grain auger motor that had quit on him mid-harvest. Otis drove over with a toolbox and had it running again in under an hour, for the cost of a $15 part instead of the $1,100 replacement unit the dealer had quoted. He didn't charge Trevor anything for the time. He said the part was the only thing that cost money, and Trevor could buy him coffee sometime if it bothered him that much. By the following spring, the story of the 1460 and the flood engine had made its way around most of Marshall County the way these things do, told a little differently each time it changed hands, and Otis had fielded enough calls from younger farmers asking him to look at something before they wrote it off that Carol started keeping a small notebook of her own by the phone, just to track who he'd promised to get out to next. He still drives the same Ford F-150 he bought in 2009. He still keeps Carl's old toolbox on the same shelf in the shop, the drawers worn smooth at the edges from 60 years of the same hands opening them. He still fixes what can be fixed. He's 75 this fall, and he still climbs into the cab himself every June. And he figures he'll keep doing it for as long as his knees allow him to reach the top step. Which, he admits, if you ask him straight, he honestly doesn't know the answer to anymore. Dean Kepler still runs the salvage yard outside Frankfort. The two men nod at each other now when they cross paths at the parts counter in town. Nothing more than that, though Kepler has been known to set aside anything that looks like it might still have some life left in it before it goes on the scrap pile, just in case somebody comes around asking. Carl Renner used to say a man could tell more about an engine with his hands than any gauge would ever tell him. And more about a person, too, if he was willing to take the time instead of trusting the first label somebody slapped on him. Otis never had much use for following advice he hadn't already proven out for himself first, and he didn't take his father's word for much of anything until he'd tested it against his own hands often enough to know it held. This time, same as most times, his father turned out to be right. Some things get written off because nobody ever checks past the waterline. Some things just need somebody willing to get down in the mud and look.